And let's welcome your host for this evening's event, Sky News presenter Stephen Dixon.
Hello and welcome to FreeStyle Connect. I'm Stephen Dixon and I'm delighted to be here as we focus on type 1 diabetes, mental health and well-being. We're here with Abbott's FreeStyle team to help bring people together to discuss their challenges and to share tactics on staying positive. Now, we are going to hear tonight some extraordinary first-hand experiences and get expert advice from our panel of healthcare professionals. But this event is also, of course, about bringing a community together. So not only will we answer some of your questions on mental well-being, but you can chat throughout the evening and offer each other some help and support. Before we go any further, though, let's invite our guests to introduce themselves, and hopefully they'll find it a bit easier to get onto screen than I did tonight. We have Professor Deborah Christie and Peter Jennings joining us. And Deborah, if we can start with you.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, Abbott, for inviting me to be part of this exciting event. So I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. I lead the psychology service at University College London Hospital for children and young people. And we work with the diabetes team there and work with young people from the ages of 0 up to 19 who are living with the challenges that diabetes can often bring. We don't just work with the children and the young people, we work with mums and dads and grandmas and granddads and aunties and uncles, really anybody that's impacted by diabetes on them getting on with their lives.
Deborah, thank you. Peter.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks, Abbott, for inviting me to come along tonight. I always love having an opportunity to talk about diabetes with people with diabetes and meet up together and share experiences. I'm very fortunate to work with people with diabetes as a diabetes specialist nurse. We've got an absolutely fantastic team where I'm based in Derby. And in my role, I basically support people using technologies to manage their type 1 diabetes and really encourage people to try and do as much as they can using those technologies and coming up with ways to basically live the lives that they want to do. Outside of work, I'm very busy. I've got 2 children who I love to spend time with, and my wife and 2 dogs, and try and get out and do lots of exercise when it's possible. Also very interested in salsa dancing, and I've just recently started playing piano. And I think sometimes the idea of kind of trying to get things right and it not going that way, I see a lot of links between trying to learn a new skill like that, which is very complex and complicated, and seeing some kind of similarities in terms of diabetes.
Peter, if you run out of things to talk about, we'll get a little salsa demonstration off you a
That
little bit
sounds
later
great,
on. Thank you both. We're also going to be joined a little bit later by Dr. Emma Wilmot, who's a consultant diabetologist at the University Hospital of Derby and Burton NHS Foundation Trust. So she'll be joining us about past. Now, of course, we are a community of type 1. We wouldn't be a community if we just sat back and listened. So please do submit your questions on the topic of mental well-being as we go. We'll try to answer some of them at the end of the event. There are also polls to take part in. And again, we'll let you know the results of some of those as we go along, technology permitting. Now, finally, of course, you can also chat to each other throughout the evening. All we ask is that, as always, you keep things nice and polite. So let's begin this evening. We're going to hear some really compelling stories, and we start with Helen Wills. Now, Helen's daughter Maddie was diagnosed at the age of 9. She's now 16, and Helen has been talking to us about their emotional journey from the moment that Maddie was diagnosed.
I knew in my head there was a potential this was diabetes, but I remember this sinking, churning feeling in my stomach into the early hours of the morning as every page I loaded on Google confirmed to me that this probably was the case. And you know, you go through that process where you try to convince yourself and find evidence that it isn't what you think it is. but there wasn't very much. When we went to the GP the next morning with the urine sample that I'd already made Maddie do, I was desperate for him to say, this is just a bladder infection, this is fine, you're overreacting, stop being neurotic, mum. And the look on his face as he dipped it told me exactly what I needed to know. And he said, there's quite a lot of glucose in here. And I said, does that mean she's diabetic? Still clinging on to the hope that he might say, no, there are other options here. But he said, I'm afraid there's not really any other conclusion. At which point I said, oh no. And I've got goosebumps whilst I'm relaying this. And my daughter started to wail. She didn't know, looking back, she says, exactly what that meant for her, but she knew it was bad. And my GP is quite an austere man. He's not good with bedside manner. He's pretty dismissive, but he put his hand on my shoulder and said, I'm sorry, it's a big diagnosis. And the world just dropped out of my stomach. Honestly, I couldn't cope with the level of emotion that I had for this. We spent a lot of time, the two of us, sitting on my bed together, where normally we would have been reading bedtime stories, but we were moving on from that a little bit, just talking. And they are the longest, deepest conversations I've ever had with her asking that question that all children ask with a diagnosis of diabetes: why me? She wanted to know why it had happened to her, and I couldn't tell her. She wanted to know how long this was going to go on for. And I'm very honest with her. I had to say, it's likely to be for the whole of your life. And she wanted to know how she could make this easier for herself, because it was just so damn hard. And I think those moments where we were sat on my bed having these long conversations about her life and how it had changed were incredibly bonding for us. I would give those conversations back in a heartbeat if it meant she didn't need to be diabetic. But what we've both benefited from over the years as a result of those conversations having to happen has been incredible, and we've had the most amazing bond. I think it's really common for parents to have guilt around a diabetes diagnosis. It doesn't matter how many times you tell someone that it's not their fault, this was going to happen anyway, whatever they did. People still go back and want to put it right. People blame themselves for not noticing the symptoms earlier and doing more about it sooner. And you can't. And I say this to people all the time, none of this is anybody's fault. In the early days, I realised that I could only deal with things in the moment, but I spent probably a good 2 years trying far too hard to get all her settings right so that we didn't have hypos every day and she didn't have to sit at school with a high blood sugar every other day. And it took me 2 years to realise that it's actually impossible to get those numbers. There is no such thing as under control when it comes to type 1 diabetes. All there is coping and going with the numbers and doing something about every number you find that isn't ideal. And for me, understanding that, and more importantly accepting that, has allowed me to not move on and not say that diabetes is any easier to manage, because it isn't, but to accept that this is our life and that we are capable of doing it. In reality, your brain is overwhelmed in the early days with information and to-do lists and worry about your child, plus grief about how your life has changed. And it takes about 3 months for those routines to embed themselves so that you can trust yourself and know that you're doing the right thing. Then another turning point came for us at about 2 years. I thought it had come earlier, but actually 2 years was the turning point when I stopped trying to control diabetes and just let myself and her and Maddie allowed ourselves to, just as I have explained, go with the numbers, look at the numbers, accept that sometimes it's not anything you did that caused that number, and the only thing you can do and the only thing you need to do actually is respond to that number and react to it. And once I realised that, that's when the grief started to settle and I was able to say, all right, this is our new normal. I would say to anyone who is thinking that diabetes is going to change their lifestyle, it doesn't have to. In fact, we've probably done more as a family that's fun and adventurous since diabetes than we otherwise would have done, because we challenge ourselves and make those things our rewards. So yes, as well as little treats every day when we need them, we use activities and things to do as rewards just to remind ourselves that our life is still livable in exactly the same way as it was before diagnosis. I think that it's okay to grieve at the beginning. It's absolutely fine to cry a lot every day if that's what you feel like doing, because that's how you work through any kind of grief, and it is absolutely a grief. I think it's okay to cry in front of your child. I think, depending on their age, I think kids do understand better than we think they do when their parents are upset, and it's helpful for them to know that this is upsetting for their parent as well as them. I also think that the best advice I can give any parent is to just take this one day at a time. I did make the mistake of worrying about the long term and the future, and I spent months and months and months reading everything I could read and storing it on the internet about diabetes and how to do things better for my girl. But I remember this very clearly. One of our diabetes specialist nurses said to me in the very early days when I was on the phone to her worrying about something, she said, "Helen, what you're talking about is PhD level diabetes. You're just doing GCSE right now, so stick with the GCSE." And she was right. I was trying to run before I could walk. So my advice would absolutely be, at the beginning, take it one day at a time, because it's a lot to take on board. And through life, we are now 6.5 years in, and still taking diabetes one day at a time is how we get through it best. You need other people by your side, and those people, your family, your parents, your brother, your sister, your friends, even your workplace, those people need to know what this is doing to you. They need to know if you're having a rough day so they can cut you some slack. They need to know if you don't want to talk about it today so that they can back off. Parents especially, we tend to be on our kids quite a lot, and my daughter now at 16 is very much trying to make me back off. And so to those people who feel maybe a bit irritated by their family wanting to know stuff, I think I'd say this: just try to understand that they are coming from a place of love and concern for you. They're not trying to tell you what to do. they're trying to work out what to do that will help you the most. And sometimes that might just mean making a hot chocolate and bringing down a fluffy pair of socks or slippers. And sometimes it might mean helping to have a look at the settings and the numbers, another pair of eyes. But just try to understand that your family suffer too. This is a diagnosis that affects the entire family. And whilst it's yours and the toughest part is on you, they feel it as well.
There we go. Look, I thought that was really interesting, actually, especially as someone, when I was diagnosed at 17 and my parents trying to get involved was extremely irritating to me. I see it from a slightly different perspective now. Let's talk to Peter and to Deborah. I mean, Peter, what Helen was saying there, does that chime in with what you see when young children particularly are diagnosed?
Yeah, that was very familiar, and I'm sure the people watching tonight will have experienced that same, whether they're parents or when I'm working with people in clinic, they tend to be a little bit older, so sometimes they might have a family member with them or a friend, and that idea of feeling just shocked, where did this come from? I thought only children got this. How have I got type 1 diabetes? So sometimes there's a lot of confusion, fear. Sometimes people are very scared but may not want to show it really. So yeah, very, very kind of familiar, the things that she was describing there.
And Deborah, the idea that this is, to an extent at least, I mean, particularly when young people are involved, but it may also apply to couples and things as well, the idea that this is almost a family condition.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's really important to remember that. Helen articulated beautifully, really, most of the results from most of the research that's been done into diabetes and the psychosocial impact. What she really highlighted was that diabetes isn't a medical condition. It's a biological, psychological, social condition. It affects your child medically, biologically. It means that they have to, have different medical intervention, but it affects you as a mother and a father, how you feel about your identity as a parent. It affects your hopes for your child, the expectations and assumptions that you had about how life would go. And the grief that Helen described is one of the most powerful experiences for, I think, nearly every single mother and father who is sitting in the GP surgery when their child or young person is given that diagnosis. You should never, I mean, we never ever say in our service that the child has diabetes. We talk about the child and young person and their family have diabetes. Everybody has to live with it, and it has an impact on everybody, brothers and sisters as well, not forgetting brothers and sisters.
And I think following on from that, sorry, Stephen, we hear the word, we talk a lot about the person with diabetes or people with diabetes. And when I see people in clinic, I try to explain that we are talking about the individual who does have diabetes, but we are also including your partner or your family members, because it doesn't, as Deborah said and as Helen said, it doesn't just impact the person. And also, you're not on your own. You're not expected to sort it out yourself. Hopefully, there'll be support who can help you when your sugar goes low or when you need some assistance in managing it as well.
But before I move on to my next point, then, that sort of brings me into, well, I was quite intrigued by Helen saying that Maddie at the age of 16 now was sort of trying to push her away a little bit. And I got the impression Helen was resisting that. And of course, that wider support is important. But can't it also be seen as positive that Maddie is now wanting to to take more control? I mean, that is an important step in itself, isn't it?
I suppose the way that we often think about it, and I talk to families about it, is that adolescents, young people in adolescence have a job description, just like you have when you got your job as a presenter and I got my job as a psychologist. And some of those essential requirements to be an adolescent are to strike out on your own, to ignore everything that your parents say, to make sure that you don't text your mum and dad where you are, that you want that, that you want to be different, but you want to be the same. There are all these things that we think about when we think about an adolescent. And then when you think about parents have a job description as well. My job as a parent and now as a grandparent are about making sure that your child is well, making sure that your child is happy, making sure that your child is successful, that you give them every opportunity that you can to grow up and lead a happy, independent life. And then diabetes comes along, and what it does is it sometimes subtly and sometimes not so subtly really gets in the way of those normal developmental tasks. It affects how you feel about your identity. It impacts on, what you're describing, what Helen's talking about with Maddie is, I want to say hello, Helen, by the way, is very much, totally normal. But, and as a parent of it, I was very lucky. My boys, didn't ever have never had a chronic illness. But, at the age of 15, 16, they were going through that process of wanting to do what they wanted to do, but still wanting a lift home and not wanting me, wanting to be independent, but not, can I borrow a fiver, mum, and don't expect to get it paid back. But when diabetes is around, how do you let them go? How do you let them go out to a party, knowing that there could be consequences if they do what you're expecting them to do as an adolescent? And that dilemma, that conflict is incredibly difficult. So it is very easy sometimes for professionals to say to parents of children living with diabetes, oh, this is normal. It's not normal. There's nothing normal about diabetes. And you do just have to take it one day at a time and see if it works and try it out, and recognize that bits of it are normal, but a lot of it isn't. And a lot of it is a much bigger challenge than a young person who doesn't have this additional demands and burden.
Okay, Peter, this sort of leads me on then to the next point about involving children, because obviously in a lot of cases, and particularly at the younger end, but I guess it applies to teenagers as well, that parents can, in the initial stages, sort of be in charge of what is happening. How do parents then move to that point where their children are engaging with their own diabetes management?
It's really important to recognize that this will vary depending on each individual person. So there isn't necessarily an exact way. And again, when I look at my own children, they seem like they're obviously two very different people. And I remember thinking, how did this happen? They've come from the same place, but they've got totally different personalities. And so when I'm working with people with diabetes, I think it's very important for me to start asking questions right from diagnosis about, do you know anybody with diabetes, to see what's their mindset about it, what's their concept of diabetes, and over the years of working together to build on that. And as a parent, what people are trying to do is prepare their child to become independent and able to manage their diabetes themselves. And whether it's young people assuming that responsibility, or whether it's an adult who's recently diagnosed, having the education that people, the knowledge and learning about diabetes and knowing how to estimate how much insulin do I need for this Big Mac, or how much insulin do I need for this curry, and being able to get it wrong and make mistakes. And I think the other benefit around the education is it's a way of making connections with other people. So again, I think if parents are looking at how do we slowly hand responsibility over to our children, when the opportunity is right, to be able to enable them to kind of undertake educational programs, and do that without them when the time is right. So we get young people sometimes doing structured education programs, and for adults who are newly diagnosed as well, which many people are probably listening who fit into that category tonight as well, is that idea of don't think, oh, I don't need to know this. I can't spend this amount of time focused on my diabetes. Think of it as an opportunity to meet other people with diabetes. And those are the real experts when you get a group of people together, whether they're young people or older people. That's where the shared knowledge and that community comes together. And that, in a way, will alleviate some of the burden of managing the diabetes from the parent. Maybe not right away. And Deborah, you've probably got some funny examples of watching that process evolve. But over time, it will. And I think Helen summed it up very nicely about needing to be patient and just allowing yourself that sense of take it one day at a time. And as a healthcare professional, we used to say to people, don't react. Don't be reactive to your blood sugar levels. Don't check them too often. And our message, I think that was a bit of a mistake. Our message has changed now and saying, what's your sugar right now? Think about how much insulin have you got on board? And if you're high and you don't have any insulin left, well, maybe you need a little bit of a top up. But, if it's an hour after you've eaten your meal, well, that's going to be normal. And we'll talk about the target levels a little bit later on tonight. But we haven't gotten it right as healthcare professionals, and we don't expect people to get it right. And going through that GCSE learning, you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay, as long as we can try and avoid, the kind of severe hypos or coming into hospital with DK. We're really trying to keep people avoiding those, but there's a lot of middle ground in there to play around with.
Is it all right, Stephen, just to sort of add a little bit about that?
Yeah, please.
So one of the important things is that if again, it's really important to remember the sort of the developmental level of the young person, and remember that changes quite dramatically, and the cognitive demands, the information that they can take in, the things that they can remember changes as they get older. And often what happens is if a little one is diagnosed, if you've got a little one that's diagnosed at around about the ages of 5 or 6, the person that's doing often most of the looking after are mum and dad. And sometimes what happens in the diabetes team is we forget that as that 5-year-old becomes a 10-year-old and becomes a 16-year-old and becomes an 18-year-old, we forget that we need to re-educate. We need to say, right, I know you've learnt stuff when you were 5 or 6, but now we need to relearn it. We need to go over it again. And you have to keep re-educating. The other thing, the adolescent brain is fascinating. It's completely different to a child's brain and completely different to an adult brain. And but the adolescent brain on a Monday, may be very motivated to self-care. On Tuesday, may not be interested at all. And then on a Wednesday, may be very interested in self-caring. Now you're smiling. I don't know if this is ringing any bells with you, Stephen. But
no.
You just kind of keep swapping. And some days you feel like getting up, and sometimes you don't. And sometimes you feel like looking after yourself, and sometimes you don't. And it's really important that period of time between sort of 13, 14, up till actually quite late, well past 19, 20, 21, the brain hasn't fully developed into an adult brain. It's still making connections. It's still in some ways not got the executive function, the bit of the brain that tells us, I really shouldn't say this, I really shouldn't do this. It's the bit that makes us grown up. And some of us never quite manage to fully develop that bit. But there's that process as well, is remembering that just because a kid is looking after their diabetes one week doesn't mean that they're going to want to do it the following week, and that's okay. And as Peter said, the worst thing that anybody could ever do to a parent is say, right, your child is 15, please step back, don't have any more involvement, your child's got to do it all. It's a recipe for disaster, absolute recipe for disaster. And if anybody ever tells you that, say, no, you're completely wrong. I am always going to be their parent, and I will always need to be involved and support them. I just need to find out what kind of support they want and need. And that's also supported by data. There is data that shows that parents that step back and do nothing, that the diabetes control is really not good.
Yeah, and it really is about taking it, as we heard from Helen, one day at a time, isn't it? Look, thank you both for now. We'll catch up with you both a little bit later on, because next we're going to hear from Aoife Willis. Now, She was diagnosed 7 years ago when she was 20, and she's told us about her turning point in her emotional journey living with type 1, which only happened at the start of this year.
I think on diagnosis, in hindsight, I was, I think, quite angry and frustrated with it. But I think the way that anger and frustration manifested itself was in trying to just continue on doing what I was doing and trying to get as much information as I can, like Dr. Google at its best, like, and which, you know, that was my way of dealing with it, was sort of saying, or it was going after information that meant I could still continue doing what I was doing in the same way I was doing it. And I didn't accept that I was going to have to make a change. This year, instead of me trying to force like the being diabetic to suit my previous lifestyle, I think this year there was the acceptance that it's nearly a partnership in a way, for lack of a better word, that there needs to be a bit of a give and take, that there's some things I can control about being diabetic, but there's other things I can't. And when those things do arise, you have to find a way to roll with it. And I think that's the best thing that has happened to me with dealing with it emotionally, was taking that step back and taking the pressure off myself to do X, Y, and Z as I used to. That it's a difference, it's changed. I'm going to have to figure out ways to go with it and to figure it out day to day and learn to accept that. I was right on the edge of that kind of burnout, I think, and I only really heard about or kind of really engaged with the idea of like the diabetic stress when I'd reached out to a friend at the start of the year, and just because I was trying to get back into running, and I thought one of the ways to get back into running was to just sign up for events. And my friend had done a series that looked really, really cool. It was kind of in different locations around Ireland. So I'd reached out to her to say, hey, how did you find it? And just a bit more information on it. But my friend actually happens to be type 1 diabetic as well. And she's been diabetic since I think around the age of 12. But by speaking to her and just happening to come up with a conversation, I had said to her that, you know, I'm having these issues like getting my blood sugars right at night, I'm waking up, I'm just so like stressed and upset about it. It was just exhausting. And there was a night too that I was just, you got up in the middle of the night and I did have a cry in the bathroom, because I was just like, I'm sick of waking up. I am sick of having to get up out of bed every night because I just can't get it right now. And it was then she kind of said to me, she was like, yeah, I've been through this, and this is kind of the stressful side of being diabetic. That's the stress. And she talked to me about the burnout and how she'd gone through it as well and things like that. And at the time, when people talk about how talking about something makes it easier, especially with your mental health, things like that, hadn't ever really appreciated it until that moment in time, how important it was not to even discuss how stressed or how much of an impact it was having on me emotionally, but just to talk about it, to say, this is how I'm trying to figure this thing out, or this is what I'm doing right now. And it just took an absolute weight off my shoulders that had been building for the six and a half years. And it was only then that I kind of went, oh my goodness, like I've been so angry, I've been so frustrated, and I've had all these internal kind of feelings. And it was kind of in that period of time where I nearly had to reached that point of it being extremely difficult, to be able to kind of come back from it and actually be forced to recognize the emotions I was dealing with since the day I first found out. Learning to roll with the punches with it, being more verbal with my needs and my wants as well, from like a family aspect, that if I'm going low, for example, and I need to sit down, or I need to kind of pause and eat something, or if I'm not feeling great in a conversation, I'm much more comfortable, and I make it a point to say, sorry, 2 seconds, I'm not feeling great, I'm just going to do this, and I explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And that way then it still creates an engagement with like my family and friends that I haven't had in the 6 years, because when I was first diagnosed, I was very independent in that I was like, I'm going to deal with it, this is my thing, there's no need for you to be upset about it, I can deal with it, it'll be grand. But what happened then was I didn't engage with them. You know, I never gave them an outlet to ask me about it. And so even just the little things as well, like having the FreeStyle Libre system, having it on your arm and having making an invisible illness visible has actually been one of the most tremendous things I think that's happened for me with dealing with it, because what it allowed me to do as well was when I first started using it, I'd go into work and everyone sees it and they say, Aoife, what's that? And I can tell them what it is and what it does, and engage in a bit of conversation. But as well, the system was so easy to use with the scanner that I was getting everyone to actually scan me. So every now and then my friends and my colleagues would come up to me and say like, Aoife, can I scan you now? Can I scan you? And just those little things that to normalise it and just to make it more visible is what has, for me, been what keeps me kind of able to accept it and able to be more positive about it, really. I think just recognising that no day is going to be the same. No bad period is going to last forever, the same way no good period is going to last forever. And it's really I think it's really important to kind of just take a step back when you are maybe going through a more difficult time, to sort of say, this is the issue in front of me, and I want to do this activity or this event. What's stopping me from doing it, and is there a way I can actually get to it? Like, what can I take control of and what can I control? And sometimes that might just be an acceptance as well. You can control your acceptance of not being able to control it as well. For me, being active was something I was before being type 1. It's more about so being part of a rowing community, enjoying running, is something that was me before type 1 was me, and ensuring that I can still do that is really, really important, because it's really important to not let being type 1 take things away from you, and that's something that is in my control, to figure out how I can not allow it to take it away from me. That's what I think is just really important sports wise. It's yes, it does have amazing benefits for being type 1 on the medical side of it, but just being emotionally, for me, it is still having myself and making sure that I can actually still be me and do the things that I've enjoyed. when I was first diagnosed, I had a lot of people say, you can't, you won't, it'll take a while. And what I would have appreciated a lot more, and I think that's what made it so difficult for me to accept as well, the amount of people who said the negatives. So instead of saying you can't do this now or it'll take a while, phrase it in ways, be realistic. Look, there are things I can and can't do. There are things that took a while to be able to figure out and do again. But it's in the phrasing of those statements that if you say, okay, look, it's going to be a while till we get you back doing X, Y, and Z, but we'll get there. And I think that's the most important thing for anyone within the family of someone, or even just caretakers of someone with recent diagnosis, is that yes, there are limitations, but there's problem solving as well. And I think problem solving is a huge thing to kind of engage with being type 1 diabetic, that not to look at the problem in and of itself, try and help them look for solutions as well.
Yeah, really interesting, the idea of the solutions with all of this. Let's talk to Deborah once again, and Dr. Emma Wilmot, who joins us now. And it is good to see you both once again. Emma, can I start with you on all of this? I have to say, and I'm looking at some of the comments that were coming through, not everyone is sort of aware of diabetic distress or burnout, and it's not something I'd really come across before. Why is it happening? How easy is it to spot?
Well, I think the bottom line is, if we think about the sheer number of things that any individual needs to do in a day of living with diabetes, it's absolutely huge. You know, if you didn't live with diabetes, you would not be needing to scan your glucose 10 to 20 times a day. You'd not be needing to inject 5 times a day. You wouldn't be needing to calculate carbs, calculate insulin doses. You would be needing to worry about hypos. You wouldn't be worrying about long-term complications. It's absolutely huge. And if there's people logging in tonight that think, I feel this is just a bit much, I'm fed up of this, I can't do it anymore, that's what diabetes burnout is. And in the medical world, we call it diabetes-related distress. So feeling like you're overwhelmed with your diabetes, feeling like you're failing with your diabetes. And the reason it's horrible when you get to that point is because it's associated with high HbA1cs, because when you feel you can't do it, people often struggle with doing the things they need to do to care for their diabetes. They struggle to scan their glucose or do the blood test and take the insulin doses. And it becomes a vicious circle where the less they do for their diabetes, the more distressed they feel about it. And trying to break that cycle is really, really tough. So if there are people, some people saying, oh, that's not familiar to me, and I think it's good if it's not, because I think for the people that do experience it, it is a very horrible place to be. But hopefully, as healthcare professionals, we can support you to break that cycle. I'm sure Deborah will have lots to say on how we can support people to come out of that.
Yeah, I mean, how common is it, Deborah? I mean, not even just the burnout, but the idea of developing sort of mental health concerns, depression with a diagnosis.
Well, if you start from children, the data suggests that maybe 1 in 4 young people with diabetes will have some sort of challenge to their emotional well-being. But I think from a clinic perspective, it's, you know, everybody's got something. You might not have I'm not keen on diagnosis. I'm not keen on labels like depression and anxiety. I think Emma and I both kind of like agree that the idea that diabetes related distress is a much nicer way of talking about the fact that it is really rotten to have to do up to 35, 40 different things every single day in order to be good. And to you know, that you're constantly thinking, am I doing good enough? Are my levels good enough? Am I managing? You know, what's going to happen when I get to clinic? I mean, that's not just children. That's also also parents. And so kids can get very fed up, parents can get very fed up, young adults can get, I mean, Aoife again gave a beautiful example, a real story, and brought to life, I think, what an awful lot of people experience, but may not notice, may not want to say anything, may not want to share with people. And the very first thing that you have to do is notice, because if you notice that things aren't feeling quite right, that's the very first step. And Aoife also used the word acceptance, and some psychologists work with a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, and that's about saying, you know, before you can move forward in sorting out distress that's connected to the medical condition that you're living with, you have to kind of accept the fact that you're fed up. You have to accept the fact that it's not going the way that you want it to go. So in terms of numbers, I think it very much depends on the study that you read, but certainly young people with any chronic condition, not just diabetes, but people with a chronic condition, are significantly more likely to develop some challenges to their emotional well-being.
Yeah, and I'll just add, because I think we've been...
Emma, looking at some of the, I just wanted to say, looking at some of the comments that were coming in, I don't know, Emma, can you hear me? Just hold on just a second, Emma. I was looking at some of the comments running through all of this as the VT was playing, and what it seemed to be pointing out was that this is actually applying to people of all ages. Actually, not just young people, not just children. I mean, there was one lady on the chat saying she'd suffered with severe anxiety for sort of 17 years or so since she was diagnosed. Are there different ways of dealing with it with different ages, or is it the same basic sort of recipe of trying to take one day at a time and come to terms with it in that way?
May I just say that actually there is nothing like having a conversation with somebody about where you are, regardless of your age, and thinking about whether or not you just need a chat with your diabetes specialist nurse, whether or not it's bad enough to start thinking about getting some counselling or psychology. And this is a particular hobby horse for me. There is nowhere near enough the level of psychological support that is needed in diabetes care. It's slightly better than it used to be, but there is nowhere near enough access to psychological support, psychologists, both in adult services and in child services. It's actually a crime, I think, that there's not enough support for people, and people have to put up. I mean, nobody should have to put up with feeling anxious for 17 years. That's awful. Nobody should have to put up with that. And the challenge is that if you go to your GP, very often the GP doesn't have access to counselling, or dismisses it and says, you know, or you get this ridiculous pull yourself together comment that still gets made, even though it's almost a joke now. But people, you shouldn't have to live for as long as 6 months feeling bad and upset and unhappy, because it has such an impact on you and on your ability to be well or to manage your diabetes. Because if you are feeling overwhelmed by everything, you will struggle to function.
Yeah, and
Emma, how important is it to be open about being a type 1 diabetic? I mean, one thing I noticed from Aoife was she was saying when she got the sensor, the FreeStyle Libre system sensor, people noticed it. Now, I have to say, I had exactly the same situation. People suddenly became aware of it. People were asking questions. People showed some interest. And Aoife clearly benefited from that. Is that a positive way forward to help us be a little bit more open?
it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, like so many things in diabetes, it will vary hugely from one individual to the next. Just reflecting on my own clinical practice and the people that I see in clinic, I would say that often the people who are hiding it from relatives, from friends, from people in their workplace, are often don't feel it one. And I think the thing that came out in the video was talking about being in partnership with your diabetes. And I think if you are living in partnership with your diabetes, you're probably more likely to be comfortable to discuss it with the people around about you. And it's a part of the acceptance of living with diabetes. And I think often if people don't have that ability to share, I think that one of the, I mean, in fact, you've seen that coming through in the chat tonight, being able to speak to other people with diabetes that get understand what you're going through is a huge weight lifted in itself. And actually thinking about the psychological support in clinics, again, I would completely agree with Deborah. It is an absolute crime that we do not have access to psychology. In paediatrics, I think there's more access. In adults, it's pretty appalling. Because the feedback that I've had from a lot of the people in my service is that when they get referred to other psychological interventions and support for counselling, if it's somebody that doesn't know about diabetes, actually, they don't understand the additional pressures on the person with diabetes. So I think having somebody who's not only a psychologist, but somebody who's trained in diabetes psychology is so important, particularly when it comes to things like diabulimia, where people are worried about their weight and emitting insulin, which is another condition that we see quite often in diabetes. And I think, diabetes related distress, we know from the recent Libre audit that our team have been conducting across the UK, 60% of 10,000 people that have gone on to the Libre in the UK had diabetes related distress. So that gives you some insight into the extent of this problem and gives you some reflection on the sheer amount of work and the toll that it takes on people living with diabetes. The good news is that the people that are using the Libre have managed to reduce their diabetes related distress through engaging with that. And again, that reflects back to what we heard in the video and the stories that you were saying, Stephen, as well, about perhaps having to accept you've got diabetes, you're wearing this. And we know that scanning more often and improving HbA1c, people tend to report lower diabetes distress as a result. So quite interesting.
I mean, what strikes me then, Deborah, through all of this is, it's about reaching that turning point and how anyone can reach that turning point to have a more positive outlook on this. There's no silver bullet here, is there? I mean, it is going to be very individual for each person and each family.
Yeah, there isn't a silver bullet, but Emma's point about the person that you're talking to, if they can, if they can be empathic, if they're warm, if they can non-judgmental, if they have an understanding, you don't have to have diabetes in order to be able to support somebody, but you do have to understand the burden. You do have to understand the challenges that get created. And so having psychologists integrated into diabetes teams is so important, because a mental health service that works with adult mental health will just not get it. They just don't get it. But there are lots of different therapeutic approaches. And the most important thing is that actually the therapy, the specific kind of therapy itself, isn't what's important. What's important is finding somebody who understands you, who can listen to you, and who can help you find your own solutions. Because every single person who's on this webinar tonight, all 500 plus, you guys all know, you all are the experts in your condition. You're all the experts in your lives. And the person that, if you're struggling, then finding somebody that can help you find those solutions within yourself, that's what you need to find, rather than somebody telling you what to do.
I think that's right. I really do think that's right. Well, look, ladies, thank you. We're going to chat to you both a little bit later on. It's interesting how we've sort of moved through the last hour into, the struggles of diagnosis, to dealing with life as a diabetic. And it is all about, we're coming to the point of trying to understand how to embrace the positivity in all of this. That's something I believe very strongly in, actually, the idea that I sort of quite like being type 1 now, because it is part of who I am after a very long time. Too long for me to work out off the top of my head, a very long time. But let's hear now from someone who's learned to embrace his emotions around type 1 and celebrates the positive moments that he creates in his day-to-day life. Jack Trigger is a solo offshore sailor who works as hard at his emotional well-being as he does at riding the waves.
First and foremost, it's about identifying those emotions and when they're happening, and that's probably the hardest part, and that's probably the thing that being diagnosed with type 1 has really taught me to do well, because you suddenly encounter it so frequently, and so you're sort of forced to identify it. And I think the biggest thing there is just being honest with yourself, and always, having that level of introspection so that you start to notice these things. And then the second stage is, of course, knowing how to deal with those emotions once you've identified that you're experiencing with them, and that's a very individual thing, and I think it's something that you learn to do over time, and the way you deal with different emotions is slightly different, but once you've identified that they're happening, then you can start that process, and actually that's almost the easy bit. When I'm racing, for example, and we're racing boats that are designed and built to the limit of technology, and then we take them into a big unpredictable environment with waves and weather systems, and so things break all the time. And certainly when I was younger in my career, when things break, you have a strong emotional reaction, because suddenly you feel like, at the very least you're uncompetitive, and how do you come back and still do well in a race, and at the very worst it can become a critical situation. And so what I taught myself to do was to just put those emotions to one side and to focus on the problem and to solve the problem. And by the time I've done that, I have all the information that I need, and I can then make a rational decision about whether I could reasonably be back in the race or not. And so that's an example for me of one way that I deal with an emotional response and turn that into something rational, and then bounce back from it. And yeah, certainly living with type 1 diabetes has made me a lot better at doing that. The reality is, if you're racing for weeks on end and pushing yourself to the limit, you physically but mentally you just can't sustain it. And so I find myself making sure that when I start to feel a bit emotional, or if something happens that makes me emotional, I'll take myself away and I'll do something like, maybe I'll listen to some music. I think that the biggest one I do is probably, and we have amazing comm systems on the boats nowadays, so I have satellite communications with land, is I'll WhatsApp a friend, and I'll maybe take 10 minutes to have a quick chat with a friend, or to listen to some music, and even though I'm not paying attention to the boat in that instant, the way that helps me to recover, and the way that refreshes me, and the way that helps me to resolve whatever emotions I'm feeling has, outweighs that the negative impact of having that time out by 100 times. And so it's the small things that seem small but can have a huge impact that I think are the best way to do it. Yeah, solo sailing is kind of the epitome of being isolated. You're on your own on a boat in the middle of the ocean at times. If you race around the world, you're close to your competitors, but also people on the International Space Station than people back on land. And it's so isolating, because you're ultimately responsible and you're accountable, and there's no one there that's going to help you. And that, in a way, is what makes it a great metaphor for living with type 1 diabetes. It doesn't matter who you're surrounded by. At the end of the day, it comes down to you and how you manage your condition. That's really challenging, but it's also very rewarding, and it's important to remember that. And I also have learned that it can be quite liberating. I think as soon as you can sort of remove yourself from the pressures and the constraints of what other people think, and realize that you're responsible and that's the only thing that really matters, then I think that's very freeing, and you find yourself doing things in different ways that I also think can be quite powerful. But the most important thing to remember is, and I'm always reminding myself of this on the boat, is that being isolated is not the same as being lonely. And it's really important to have support networks, and despite everything I say about solo sailing, it's really a team sport. You know, the team helped to get the boat to the start line, they helped to design the boat, they helped to prepare me and all the equipment, but most importantly they're there when you're racing, they're there when I'm racing, and I know that they're there supporting me, and if I have any challenges, even though technically I'm unassisted, I'm allowed to ring them up and I'm allowed to talk through my problems, I'm allowed to bounce ideas off them, and the power of that is unquantifiable. And it's the same living with type 1. Even though you're isolated, even though at the end of the day it comes down to you, just talking to someone about it can make such a huge difference, and remembering that being isolated is not the same as being lonely, and there are all these people around you that can support you and that want to help you, and yeah, that makes a huge difference. What I've learned over the years is that challenge is often accompanied by uncertainty, and there's a famous quote that I really like by Margaret Drabble, a famous author, which says, "If nothing is certain, then everything is possible." And what that does for me is it kind of epitomizes this idea that it doesn't matter what the challenge is. If you can get the right mindset, then you can solve the problem and everything else follows. And it says to me, this is the challenge, but what's the opportunity? What's the silver lining? What can I learn? What is going through this challenge going to teach me or going to give me, or what can I make happen? And I think that helps me to change my mindset. In the instance, just reminding myself how important it is to do that, and how to do that, and to be able to see beyond the challenge that's directly in front of you. I wouldn't say I want to go and sail around the world non-stop and solo unassisted, and just set that as a goal and put that out there, and then have no understanding of the process to get there. And so it's very important to make goals that are relatable and tangible, and to know what the process is, and how does this apply to living with type 1? Well, what's the goal of type 1? That there's no end point that you're trying to reach for, and so really it's the same, because it feels like a goal that's so far away or that's non-existent, and so you have to really focus on the small steps. And it's kind of a common saying would be to not worry about the goal, but to enjoy the process. And I'm not sure I totally agree with that, because it's impossible to always enjoy the process. But I think how I would phrase it is, I would say what I try and do is I try and trust the process. And again, it's about this whole thing to do with mindset and to do with how to overcome the small challenges, but to trust the process and to focus on the small steps, but to also make sure that that's in perspective, and that as long as you're moving in the right direction, I'm quite an analytical person. I like to think of it as maybe a trend line, and it doesn't matter if there are the small ups and downs, but as long as you're always moving in the right direction, that's the really important thing, and to make sure that you look after yourself in that instance, and that you sort of kind yourself and give yourself a chance to make those small mistakes, which are inevitable, as long as you're still moving towards that big goal, or in the right direction in the big picture. For me, a very powerful word is gratitude. Being grateful for everything I have, even when I'm struggling to be positive. And I sometimes do that in a funny way where I remind myself what I'm doing, and I help to remind myself that what I'm doing is cool. So whether that's being in the middle of an ocean on a boat, which I think is really cool but not very relatable to, or whether it's managing type 1 diabetes and being effectively my own pancreas, or having these amazing machines and sensors that we wouldn't have had not that long ago, and how cool I think that is. Not everyone gets to do that nor have that, and so I think that really helps me. And then the final thing is, and I say this every time, and it's something that my friend and mentor Alex Thompson, who's currently racing in a solo round the world race, he's currently leading the race, it's called the Vendée Globe, and he tells me every time, he says, Jack, to be positive, all you need to do is smile and the rest will happen.
Now, that's a message. That is a message, I think, which is really positive and really nice. And it's nice to see, amidst all the conversations that we've been having, it's nice to see someone come out with so much positivity. And I was quite struck by the gratitude side of that as well. I mean, yes, we all have this sort of burden, if you want to view it in that respect, but we have all this technology and support. We don't all have the right technology, we don't all get the right support, but there's a lot of it out there. And even the community support and all the chat that you're having now is very important. Let's talk to Emma and Peter. Emma, when you hear someone like Jack being so positive, having that positive outlook, it does raise the question for those of us who aren't always that positive about our type 1. How do we sort of set ourselves achievable targets or achievable goals, either with our diabetes or with our levels of positivity?
It's really challenging, isn't it? And again, like I said earlier, everybody is so different in how they live their lives with diabetes. And it very much dependent on your circumstances. If you're a single mother of 4 kids worrying about how you're going to get money together to feed your kids, trying to be positive about your diabetes is the least of your worries. And we all have different struggles in life, and where diabetes fits in will vary from one person to the next. But if you do have space in your life to focus on diabetes, it is about setting very realistic targets that are achievable. And one of the things that using the FreeStyle Libre has enabled is that everybody living with diabetes can now look at time and range on their device or when they download their data, compared to the old days where we used to look at HbA1c, a blood test done a maximum once every 3 months, something you can't measure in between. But now we've finally got a way of looking at glucose levels and measuring time and range and looking at the percentage of your glucose levels between 3.9 and 10 and keeping an eye on that from week to week, month to month. So even if you're sitting with 10% of your glucose levels in that range, saying to yourself, right, within the next week, I'm going to nudge that to 15%. That's an achievable target. It's something that you can monitor and keep an eye on and, celebrate every little success. Diabetes is its own, and when it doesn't work out, don't beat yourself up. This is type 1 diabetes, not something that you're doing. I think I spend my life in clinic telling people to try and really focus on the positives and not get down with the days where things just don't go according to plan, because that's just part of the disease.
Yeah, I know that feeling. I mean, Peter, that sort of leads me on to the point of you hear a lot. I mean, especially in the early days of diagnosis, about sort of bad numbers or doing something wrong so that your bloods are going a bit haywire. How do we change our mindset on that and realise that it is just part of the journey, part of the process?
I think it's really important that there will be people who've had diabetes for a number of years who that was the approach that was used in clinic. It was almost like a scare tactic. If you don't do this, this is what will happen to you. And I think we're at the stage now from a healthcare professional point of view where we say sorry to people, sorry that you had that experience, because we've moved on now and we recognize the challenges of living with diabetes. And we also recognize the fact that whether it's psychological tools or whether it's the technology, we don't quite have the technologies that we need yet that will enable the diabetes in a sense to do the mundane stuff of what's happening with the sugar and how much more insulin do we need. And rather than our minds having to run that kind of constant thought process, we're looking for handing that over to technology. And I think when we get there, we'll be able to kind of alleviate some of the burden around living with type 1 diabetes. So where does that fit in? Well, what we're trying to do is say there is hope out there. I think we're very much at a stage where it's in the near future where more people will have access to technologies like that. I think, sorry, Stephen, you know what? I've forgotten the first question that you asked.
Well, it's all about how we sort of think about the journey of it all. I mean, one thing Jack said was, you know, when you make little mistakes, what have you, and your bloods are you know, yo-yoing or kangarooing or however you want to phrase it. You know, it's being able to sort of take that on the chin a bit and not let it get you down, isn't it?
Yeah. And sorry, I remember, about the good and bad blood sugars. It really is that sense that now we're not really worried about having an unrealistic blood glucose target. Before, trying to aim for, you know, pre-meal glucose between 4 and 7 and test your sugar 4 times a day and have it always be in range. A lot of people felt like that was what they were expected to do. Now in clinic, we try to talk to people, as Emma mentioned, about time in range. And hey, do you understand what time in range is? And many people out there might not yet, but you've got a much broader range of somewhere between 4 to 10, where we're expecting you not to spend all your time in that range, but roughly around, well, wherever you are, we'll aim to try and move it up and increase the time that you're spending in that range. And the amount of time that you're spending below 4, if you're having frequent low blood sugars, we'll try and decrease the amount of time that you're spending in that range. And it will all depend where people start from. But why are we doing that? Because ideally we want people to have kind of a more enjoyable life, a higher quality of life. And if we can have that as our goal, then there's the motivation maybe a little bit more to think, okay, if I can be able to go to bed at night without having horrible hypos or really high blood sugar and not being able to sleep, we can stop some of those kind of cycles around not being able to sleep, so feeling unwell, not having the energy to look after my diabetes, so then not really paying much attention, then it being erratic overnight. If we can start to just modify and think, okay, would this help you to sleep better at night? Let's try this. And then sometimes I find in clinic that people feel like there's a little bit of motivation there. But again, always my default is to say, have you spoken to anybody else with diabetes? Do you know what tips or hints that they might use that have helped them to deal with these situations?
I mean, what strikes me, Emma, about all of this is how everything is interlinked, whether you want to look at sort of our mental health, our physical health, quality of life. These are all issues which are absolutely interlinked, aren't they, when it comes to type 1? Oh, you're muted there, Emma.
Sorry.
There
We don't get through 2020 without telling somebody they're muted, do we? Every day.
No.
I've been reflecting as time's gone by, and I think that, as Pete mentioned, healthcare that's been provided to people with diabetes has got a lot to answer for, because that sort of beat people up with a stick and tell them that they're not doing well enough, I think has created a lot of the psychological distress that we see this day. That people should not be feeling fearful about coming to clinic. They should not be worried about getting told off. I think, when you think about this as a bigger picture, why do we have diabetes services? It's about improving glucose levels to prevent complications. Why do we want to prevent complications? Because they have a negative impact on quality of life. But the way I look at it is, if the diabetes care that you're receiving now to try and help you achieve the glucose levels to prevent the complications that cause the impact on quality of life is already affecting your quality of life negatively, we've lost the plot. So to everybody that's listening out there, if you have a diabetes team that are beating you up, that make you feel awful about how you manage your diabetes, go somewhere else. You need to have healthcare professionals around you that understand diabetes and that support you to get the best out of whatever situation that you're in. Type 1 diabetes is a really, really tough gig, and you need people around you, whether that's family, friends, healthcare professionals, that will support you to get the best out of the situation you're in.
I have to say, I stopped going. I mean, it's a lot of years ago now, 15, 20 years ago. I stopped going to see my clinician for because of the getting weighed. I got absolutely paranoid about getting weighed, and now, so now when I go now, I just say no. You're not going to weigh me. I don't want to be weighed. And they're fine. You know, my team are fine with that. It's fine. So you can sort of take a little bit of control back, can't you?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. You know, we have people that come into clinic that perhaps don't want to download their FreeStyle Libre device. And again, nobody should be forcing you to share that. And it's my job as a clinician, if somebody's not comfortable sharing that data, is exploring why and building confidence so that they feel in a safe space with me to share that data. So, you know, and everyone listening today, I'm sure will have, you know, experiences in the past where they've opened their diary and somebody's gone, your glucose is 20 there, what on earth are you doing? That's not a supportive way of managing diabetes in the clinical setting. So, yeah, I think that, and I'd like to think that healthcare professionals are more on board and more recognising of just how tough this is, and that things are getting better. But again, it's not something you can really measure. It's life experience, isn't it?
Yeah, Peter, is part of the problem that, you know, when you're seeing people in clinic, obviously you're only seeing them for a relatively short amount of time as a DSN. Where are you in terms of being able to push people to other organisations or other groups where they can get additional help?
Well, my mindset has really changed over the years, where I used to think, well, who's involved in the diabetes care? Obviously, it's the person with diabetes, it's their family members, and then it's us, the healthcare professionals. And what's really changed is that within our locality, we've got a great group of people who have a Facebook page where they kind of approached Emma to say, what do you think about getting this started? And she said, hey, why not go for it? And it's now got loads of people on it, and they're a community where they work together and provide support. And I've had some experience with other diabetes online communities. And again, I was always a little bit like, I'm not so sure about this whole diabetes online community stuff. But as I joined it myself and started engaging with other people and realizing how powerful it was to at any time be able to post a question when I'm at my wit's end and say what's going on, and to get some helpful advice back from people who weren't judgmental. I've revisioned my kind of view of what diabetes care is. It's obviously the people, whether that's the family members and the individual with diabetes, it's us as healthcare professionals, but just as equal part of that is the kind of diabetes online community. So if you're someone who's seen me in clinic, you'll know that I always mention, oh, have you heard about this group? Have you been on this group? Have you joined this group? And sometimes people say, I'm not into Facebook. And I say, oh, it's not about sharing your pictures of your cat or photos of your food at a restaurant. It's about connecting with other people who really will get your situation with your diabetes. So to me, that's the most powerful thing that we can offer, is to share that with people. And if you don't have a system like that set up in your area, I would encourage you to talk to your healthcare provider about, do you know anybody else who kind of gets it with their diabetes, who's positive about that? And then you can create a group that is supportive, but also able to kind of, provide kind of positive feedback to people as well when they need it.
Yeah, just being able to talk to people who get it is really great. It is a really good thing. Look, thank you both. We're going to bring Deborah back into the mix if we can, because a lot of you have submitted questions and you've answered our poll questions as well. So with all of our guests, we'll go through some of those with you. And I want to start with the polls, if I can. We've got three main polls running. What helps you to stay positive about living with diabetes? The highest number of responses there, 32%, when I last checked this, said exercise, which intrigues me because we know there's obviously a lot of benefits with exercise, but it can also be a big challenge for people. So I think that's very positive. When does diabetes most affect your mental health? When I'm alone, says 34%. That's the highest number there. And the main challenge post-diagnosis was handling daily management of the condition at 55%. Now that says a lot, doesn't it? If only about the amount of information that whether you're the patient or the family, the amount of information you have to take on board at diagnosis is absolutely overwhelming. Emma?
No, it definitely is. And type 1 diabetes is a lifelong learning journey. Some people pick up lots of the information that they need to manage it in the first weeks and months. Some people, it's years and years. And I think those first few weeks after diagnosis, it's such a steep learning curve and such an important time to have support around you. We know that, and actually the people that we know that get depressed in the early stages of diagnosis, that really matters because it tends to track time. And so if you've got mental health issues around the time of diagnosis, it's more likely to get further down the line. And I think as healthcare professionals, we need to get better at recognising that and putting the support in early on. And it comes back to Deborah's issue. We need more psychological support for people living with diabetes.
Yeah, which leads me perfectly on to one of the questions that's been sent through. I think I'll throw this one in your direction, Deborah. How common is it for people with diabetes to suffer from a mental health illness?
Well, I think there's mixed evidence there, but just in the general population, 1 in 4 people will suffer from or struggle with depression and/or anxiety. So 1 in 4, depression is sometimes called the common cold of mental illness. So depression is incredibly common in the regular population, the whole population. And as I said earlier, if you have a chronic health condition like diabetes, then it will significantly increase your chances of developing something like depression or anxiety, an eating disorder, or as I've said, actually a kind of sub-threshold level of diabetes distress. There was a really good comment in the chat that actually I think really kind of highlighted how currently the 446 people that are on this webinar are the experts, because everybody's been posting some fantastic papers. And the question was about the kind of the direction, mental diabetes kind of does diabetes cause mental health problems? But what about mental health problems causing problems with diabetes? And it's important to remember it goes both ways. And that if you have significant levels of low mood or very high levels of anxiety, that's going to have a significant impact on your diabetes control because of, there's the physiology. Don't need to go into the physiology, but there's a lot of evidence to show links between depression and type 2. Interestingly enough, I know there's a few people also saying, well, what about type 2? But actually depression and type 2 are strongly connected. So yeah, you're much more likely to have a challenge with your emotional well-being if you're living with diabetes, but equally if you've got low mood, that will impact on your control. And sometimes, and then you get stuck in this really vicious cycle of, your control's not good, you feel bad about that makes you feel low, and because you're low, that's worse for your diabetes. And so it's a rotten vicious cycle.
Okay, Peter, I've got one for you here. Someone's asked, how can I deal with people being dismissive of the seriousness of diabetes? Oh, let's just unmute you.
Unmute me, thank you. Maybe it's about signposting them to resources, but I think also about, for those people living with diabetes, it's realizing that I might not be able to change their perspective, and for them not to take it personally. We can't control what other people's opinions of diabetes are. And it sometimes is asking questions around, well, do you know somebody with diabetes? Because they might have an aunt or uncle with a different form of diabetes who's in a very different situation, who may be thinking, well, they've got this type of diabetes, so that's how everybody's diabetes is. and sometimes they just need to hear about your own experience. But I would encourage you to, in a sense, rather than thinking about changing their opinions, because that can be hard to do, is to just have a little message that maybe you say in your mind of, this isn't my issue. This isn't my issue. I'm not gonna let them put that on to me. And a lot of people in clinic will raise it, especially this time of year when we're getting near. We've got lots of holidays happening, and it's not uncommon to be told, oh, you shouldn't be eating that, or why are you eating that? And that's really that's probably what some people are going to be experiencing. Or I told you not to eat that because look at how high your sugars are. So having some, playing through that in your mind a little bit and thinking, actually, this time of year, what we say in clinic is enjoy yourself. It's a holiday. Take your insulin. Don't be surprised if you put on some weight in January, because that's what happens to everybody when if you're eating lots and you're maybe not exercising as much. But don't try to focus on your diabetes all the time. Sometimes it is okay to have a holiday, and it relates a little bit to the very first speaker that we heard when she was saying, I realized we needed to step back and look at what a number is and then make a decision about what to do with that number, and then go ahead and let it go and enjoy yourself, rather than it needing to be perfectly controlled all through the holidays.
Yeah, I think that there can't be anybody watching this who hasn't been told you shouldn't be eating that at some point. It's a perennial thing, and it's partly. I tell you, I mean, one thing I enjoy once a month. It's a once a month treat to me, is to order a pizza.
All right. With
my other half, and I always say, look, I expect it. I'm as careful as I can with it, and a very long dose on the pump, but I expect my bloods to be screwed in the morning. Yeah. And I think it's about giving yourself that little bit of leeway, isn't it? So I'll deal with it in the morning. Look, let's get something which is sort of quite clinical here, Emma, for you. Someone's asked, can we have more details, please, about how hypos affect brain cells and whether it might affect my memory, intelligence, and emotions?
Yeah, so I mean, hypoglycemia is the pitfall of trying to control glucose levels, isn't it? And we know that, most people have at least a couple of hypos a week. So in terms of, from a clinical point of view, a significant hypo is when you get down to a level of less than 3. And that's because at that level, it affects how your brain functions. If you're getting down below 4, you should be starting to feel sort of sweaty, tingly, palpitations. But it's when you get to 3 and below that your brain's not getting enough glucose, and that's where it starts to affect and people can become confused and things. Now, some of the risks from hypoglycemia, if you're having lots of hypos below 3, you're teaching your brain that it's okay to get down to that level. And what we find is that sometimes people start to lose their awareness of hypoglycemia, where unfortunately they can get to the point where they become, if they get to the point of being confused, or they can have seizures. And I'm sure there's people logging on that have perhaps sadly experienced that, where they've ended up in hospital with hypos, etc. Now, we work hard to minimise the amount of hypos that people have so that doesn't happen. But we know that in the people that do start to lose awareness of hypos, and then obviously if you can't feel them coming on, you can't avoid them, and they can get into a cycle of lots of hypos and lots of really nasty hypos. And in those instances, it can start to affect long-term brain function. Now, fortunately, based on my clinical experience, that's a very small minority of people, but that can happen. But again, this is based on often people with long-standing diabetes that used to be peeing on a urine stick to guide their insulin therapy, many decades ago. And I would like to think that here we are in 2020 with using the Libre and CGM and being able to look at time and range, we finally have a way of monitoring glucose levels, taking into account the risk of hypos. In the past, we used to say, get that HbA1c down, and hypos were forgotten about. But I think we finally today can look very closely at how much hypos you're having and minimise the risk. And I would like to think that if we can strive to get everybody below 4% time below range, then we will absolutely minimise the risk of those horrible, nasty hypos happening and prevent that loss of awareness with the long-term consequences.
Stephen, can I please just make a comment which is really for parents out there, of parents of children with diabetes who have had a few hypos. So there is some evidence that hypos with seizures do affect the child's developing brain, and can have an impact on attention and concentration and school function. And the guidelines are very clear that if your child has more than 2 hypos close together in a year, you should be asking for a cognitive assessment. And it's really important that teachers understand the impact of a hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia on a child's ability to function in the classroom. So if you think that, if you imagine that when you start to drop, if you're in the classroom and you're trying to do a maths class, and your sugars start to drop and your attention and your concentration start to go down, you've lost 20 minutes of the lesson. If you then go out the lesson in order to correct whether it's a hypo or a hyper, you lose 20 minutes of your lesson, and then it takes 20 minutes to get back up into range again. And so that young person hasn't just lost the bit of learning that they've left the classroom for, or they've been distracted for while they've corrected. They've lost. And it's really important when you're putting in for educational health care plans that you provide the teachers with information and evidence. And I can't remember what FreeStyle want to do, but there are a couple of chapters that are in a book on psychosocial aspects of living with diabetes that describe the effects of hypos and hypers, and also provide advice and support for teachers and strategies for teaching kids who've got difficulties. So I'm sure FreeStyle will add those to a resource that will be available online.
Okay, well, look, going from the younger end then to the maturer end of the scale with this, Deborah, this is about the link. Someone's asking about the link between type 1 mental health and the menopause, if things can't get any more stressful.
Well, some of that's an area I have a lot of knowledge about, but not necessarily from an academic perspective. I mean, diabetes is about, as Emma said, diabetes is about glucose, it's about the brain, it's about how your brain is functioning. And the menopause is a significant time when your hormones do all sorts of weird stuff to you. So there's no question that if your hormones are not, are all over the place, that they're going to have an impact on how you're feeling. And the menopause itself can make people feel pretty lousy. And so again, it's this question of direction and a cycle. It's things aren't linear. Things don't go in straight lines. There's no straight line in nature. And that's true. There's no straight line in mental health either. It's all about cycles and circles. And that if you are in a cycle, if you're in a cycle of feeling bad about yourself because your hormones are all over the place, which then affect your diabetes control, which then you feel bad about, that then feeds into your emotional well-being. So, but again, it's ask for help. You've got to ask, you've got to speak to somebody. Don't wait for 6 months to go to clinic. Phone up and speak to somebody like Peter. Phone up and speak to somebody like Emma and say, I know I don't have a clinic appointment for 6 months, but I am feeling dreadful. What could I do? Who could I talk to? Where can I get help? And I noticed in the chat also, there was somebody that said, where's the practical advice? It's all very well telling us this, but where's the practical advice? Try different things. Mindfulness, for example. There are some great mindfulness books which can teach you about mindfulness and how mindfulness can help you balance the physical and the mental. It's not that your body and your mind are separate. Your mind and your body are so connected. And if you didn't have a body, you wouldn't be able to carry your mind around with you. And if you didn't have a mind, then your body wouldn't be able to work. The body and the mind are totally connected, and you have to kind of keep that in mind. And just ask is what I say. You know, if you are, and I've noticed that there are some, you know, there are people on this webinar who are in their 60s and 70s who are saying, you know, I'm miserable now. Well, ask, and if your GP dismisses you, talk to your diabetes consultant or your diabetes nurse, specialist nurse. Don't suffer in silence. It's your right to demand help and your right to demand support. And if you don't get it straight away, keep asking. Just keep asking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, a final question. Peter, I'll throw this one at you, I think, but I mean, anyone can chip in as always. Someone's asked, how do I cope with the stress of waking up now in the night? This is, I mean, they've said to either inject insulin or to prevent a hypo. Is this something where actually the technology and something like the FreeStyle Libre system does actually help us in being able to make clinical decisions about what is happening while we're asleep?
It definitely does. I mean, before we were asking people to test their blood glucose and maybe even wake up to check their sugar to see what was happening so we could have some clue. Now we, you know, if you are fortunate enough to be able to have FreeStyle Libre technology where you can see the profile of what's happening overnight, that can be a really useful learning tool. And, you know, if you have a lot of people are caught in this cycle where they might be on an insulin regime where they have to have a snack before they go to sleep at night. And it's very hard sometimes to work out, if you're scared about having a low blood sugar when you're sleeping at night, how much is enough. So, well, I'll have a little bit more, you know, I'll just make sure that I've got enough chocolate or cereal or toast. No matter what they're eating, it can sometimes be hard to know how much is enough, especially if they've been trying to exercise as well. And I think what happens is, in clinic, what I try to say to people is, well, just live your life and see what's going on, and see if you can recognize any type of pattern of what's your blood sugar doing, you know, when you have this snack before bed. And if you see that you're running a little bit higher, you might want to talk to your diabetes healthcare professional about making some adjustments to the type of insulin that you're on. You might want to talk to them about the way that insulin gets delivered. So if you're taking injections, you might look at a technology like an insulin pump. But there might also be some of your own kind of decisions that you can make, and being patient with those to say, if I'm a little bit scared of going to sleep at night because of having a hypo, allowing yourself kind of some time to just watch and see, okay, how many nights can I prevent myself from having a hypo? And maybe running your blood sugar a little bit high. And if you get to that stage where you'd predict, you know, how much money would you be willing to wager that you're gonna stay high overnight? And when you get in that sense where you're like, well, I'm definitely gonna be high, that's when maybe you'd start to think, okay, well, maybe I'll cut down on the amount of snack I'm eating, or maybe it's time to increase my insulin a little bit. So wait until you feel confident that you can see a pattern, and that's the time to kind of take some action. That's talking about patterns, and I realize that for a lot of people, you'll say, my diabetes doesn't have any type of pattern. And that can be challenging. Again, you could think about keeping a diary to look at, does it happen on certain nights of the week? But you also might want to talk to your healthcare professional then about other types of insulins or other ways of delivering insulin.
I've had a ping through on the phone, which indicates that there's been quite a few people asking this question, which is back to the burnout issue, the diabetes distress. So I'll throw this open to any of you that wants. First one to chip in on this one. Tips for dealing with diabetes distress. And I was intrigued looking at the message board, how many people this affects, because I've been so lucky that I haven't had to deal with this. It's not really been an issue for me, but clearly it's almost soul destroying for those people who do have to deal with it. So what are the tips? Emma, let's kick off with you in terms of actually dealing with this or starting to address it.
Yeah, so there's things that have got evidence behind them, and there's things that are based on my experience. The things that have got evidence behind them for helping diabetes related distress. So the first thing is Daphne structured education. So if you're not aware of what this is, it's a 5-day education course that runs through everything to do with type 1 diabetes. But I think the most powerful thing about it is in a group of 6 to 8 people who all have type 1 diabetes going on the same journey and sharing experiences. And in clinical trials, it's been shown that if you've gone through Daphne 4 years down the line, you will still have less diabetes distress compared to the beginning because of that process. We also know from using the FreeStyle Libre that the use of that technology is associated with reduced diabetes distress. And also we've got closed loop systems coming out where the pumps talk to the continuous glucose monitor, and it lessens the amount of work you need to do for your diabetes. And again, people come back saying that that makes them feel so much better. But in terms of more practical things about what you do, and this again is based on my experience of being in clinic with people with diabetes related distress, is give yourself a diabetes holiday. Now, you're probably thinking, she's nuts. We need insulin to survive. So let me explain what I mean by that. So it is really easy to get stuck in that sort of hamster wheel of, I need to do better, I need to do better, and constantly striving and beating yourself up when you see high glucose levels. So when I say a diabetes holiday, what I mean is stop thinking about it. Do the insulin, do the blood glucose levels, but stop putting in the emotional effort. Stop striving and have a couple of weeks where you just do the bare necessities. So you're still getting the insulin, you're still checking your glucose, you're still giving the corrections, you're just not putting as much mental effort into it. Because there's no proper as good as you can get to diabetes holiday, so just a bit of time to take the weight off.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting. I never thought about it in that sense. Also fascinated by what you said about Daphne. I did a Daphne course before I was allowed to pump, and I know they're difficult. If you're interested in one, they are difficult to get on. This is the problem. But it was the first time I'd ever spent time with other type 1 diabetics, and there was 3 people younger than me, 7 people older than me. One of the ladies there was a pensioner, and it didn't matter. All that connectivity and that understanding each other and spending effectively 5 days together was an incredibly positive experience. It was really, really good. From the people you see, Peter, who are struggling with this, I mean, what would you say to them?
I totally back up with what Emma was saying about having the education. Again, do you know anybody else with diabetes? Who helps you with that? Who can you kind of chat to that's not kind of one of your healthcare professionals? So again, I'm always signposting people to join the Facebook groups in our area. And I'd encourage people to also think about, what can I give to somebody else who's got diabetes? And it's really powerful. Diabetes UK is looking for volunteers to provide support on family away weekends, to mentor other people with diabetes. So even though sometimes you might feel, oh, I'm so much struggling with my diabetes, it might not be the right time in that stage. But for those of you who are living with diabetes, who you can by giving people something of yourself, ironically can really help. I don't know how you feel about yourself and the value that you feel. And I guess as healthcare providers, we all probably see that. I think that's one of the benefits of being in healthcare, that when someone comes back and says, oh, thanks so much for what you mentioned, I tried this and it really worked, you end up feeling, well, I didn't really do much, but thanks a lot. But it does make you feel a bit better. So if you've got opportunities to give to other people with diabetes, like what people are doing on the chat tonight, or when we get back to face-to-face, being able to do some volunteer work. And then finally, the last thing I would say, I'm a real big advocate of exercise. I think getting out and moving, or just moving indoors, there are lots of programs kind of online, and doing that on a regular basis. And I realize that causes challenges for people with diabetes. So maybe pick one time a day to exercise initially if you're getting started. And I tend to recommend people to start in the morning, because that's when we're potentially a little bit more resistant to the way that the insulin works. So you might find hypos are a little bit less of a problem in the morning. But if you're feeling distressed and burnt out, actually doing some activity, again, sounds ironic, but after a few days, you might see that some of those niggles and stresses start to just damper down. and disappear a little bit.
It's fascinating that, and it leads me perfectly, Peter, as though you'd planned it, onto the results, the final poll results of the night. What will you wake up tomorrow and do differently after tonight's event? Do an exercise I enjoy, 32%. That's the top result. Next, connect with an online community focusing on diabetes is 25%. Talk about worries I have with healthcare professionals is 18%. Reaching out to friends and family at 12%. Connect with an online community focusing on an interest, 7%. And also at 7%, look up online influencers and role models to get inspiration. I'm really encouraged by that. And Deborah, it's fascinating because we've heard it so many times. We know exercise is good for our glucose control. We know it's good for general health. We know it's good for mental health. Seems like the message is getting through.
Yes, absolutely. I think that so there's one of the resources that FreeStyle will make available is a link to an article that was published on diabetes burnout in 2017, and it's got 8 top tips. Really, 8 top tips for managing burnout. And the first one is noticing. If you notice something's wrong, then that's the first step. Being kind to yourself and focusing on solutions rather than the problems. So a practical way of doing this is journaling, or making a point of posting on Facebook one good thing that happened today, or one thing I'm proud of, and how did I do that? Keeping track of sparkling moments. The third one is making sure that you ask for help and not suffering in silence. Everybody said that, get somebody to help, get somebody to share. I absolutely agree with taking a holiday, and parents can take a holiday too, or partners can take a holiday, because they can, parents can suffer from burnout just as the kids can. And keeping things in balance is really important. It's what matters to you, and rather than the healthcare professionals. Some of the questions that up there, people have said, well, what do I do? Well, use your diabetes team and don't suffer with silence. We've talked about that. And I've also mentioned mindfulness. I think mindfulness has a lot of power to help people with chronic conditions really change their relationship with the illness and with the way that it impacts on them. And there's some really good websites, there's some fantastic apps, there's some really good references and books that you can get. And what Peter has said, and what this is all about, is connection, making connections. Don't connect with other people. I mean, I don't know if anybody saw the social dilemma, which is a bit scary and kind of puts you off social media. But actually, social media and technology can be a real force for good. So look at blogs, look at websites, find stuff that works for you, find people that connect and understand. And all of those things will help reduce burnout, will help change and shift your relationship with diabetes. You aren't diabetes. Diabetes is one tiny jigsaw piece that's part of the bigger you. It's a bit of you. It's a part of your identity, but it isn't your only identity. And that's a really important thing for everybody to kind of find a way of grasping. And the being kind to yourself might mean giving yourself permission to go out for a run or do some yoga, giving yourself permission to be compassionate and care for yourself. We're not kind enough to ourselves. And everybody tonight who's been putting the comments and the questions, I would say, is find a way to be kind to yourself and compassionate. Do something nice for yourself, because that will also have a really good effect. If we just take time to be nice to ourselves rather than being continually overwhelmed.
Yeah, no, good advice. Good advice. And if you're one of those people, as I did for many years, thinking I can't face doing the exercise, go for a walk. Go for a walk for an hour. It's easy, and it's actually a very good fat burner. And it does, believe you me, it brings your levels down. So it can be a nice, gentle way. Plus, you can have a nice, quiet think while you're doing it. That's my bit of advice for the evening.
You can do mindful walking.
It's great. I love it.
Yeah, you can do
Well, exactly.
So you can walk mindfully, you can eat mindfully, you can even look after your diabetes mindfully. And and if you haven't got access to a psychologist, then you've got access. There's some really good resources out there that can help you. But you have to make the decision to do it. You have to notice it and make the decision to do something. So do something positive tomorrow.
And I was just going to say was
Go on, Emma.
Yeah, just one thing just to say for everybody, because I can just see how much people have got out of the chat tonight. And I think this just reflects how important it is to connect with other people with diabetes and to reflect on what Pete was saying. In Derby, we've got a local Facebook page, 600 people. I want to just tell you a very quick story to give you some insight into how life-changing this is. There's one of my patients who went down to the playoffs at Wembley when Derby got down there. He got there, discovered his insulin pen had run out. So there he was thinking, that's me, I can't go watch Derby at the playoffs because I don't have any insulin, I need to go to hospital. He phoned 111, they said go to hospital. He's like, I've come all this way, that's my day ruined. Then he remembered he had the local Derby Facebook page. So he went on there and within a couple of minutes, somebody tracked him down and given him an extra insulin pen. If that's not life-changing, what is? So to everybody out there, you can do that easily. Just speak to your local diabetes team, ask them to let other people in the service know about a group that you run, and then you've got round-the-clock support. And a lot of people that have struggled with their mental health come back to clinic telling me that having somebody reach out and check in them and building friendships, and people now talk in the waiting room at clinic, something that never happened a few years ago. So that's it. I would definitely suggest that everybody can do that in their local patch.
Oh, do you know what? It's nice to end on a really positive little story as well. Look, thank you all very much indeed. Big thanks to all of the panel tonight, because it is the end, I'm afraid, of our Freestyle Connect event. Also, really sincere thanks to Helen, to Aoife, and to Jack for being so open and honest about their emotions as they shared their stories with us. Do visit our website for more inspiration and resources on looking after your emotional well-being. And most of all, thank you for joining us tonight and for bringing a community together to connect and to discuss the things that really matter to all of us. We'd love to know what you thought about it all tonight. You'll get a survey when we finish, and we would, of course, love to hear your thoughts. So thanks once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.